Good morning. All right, we are on welcome. Good morning, everybody. Happy Labor Day weekend. Um, we are on page, God bless you, 35 thereabout. I'm going to just briefly kind of bring us to where we are. We discussed the distinction between relationship with God that's built through the faculties of intellect and emotion, like a human relationship that is built on emotional connection, intellectual appreciation and understanding of the other person. And over time, we can enhance and intensify that relationship through strengthening our connection with the other, through better understanding the other. And in a similar way, we come to our relationship with God through recognizing God's greatness in the world, the kindnesses that God performs for us. And in so doing, we intensify our love and our connection to Hashem, to God. But then there's a higher dimension, which is actually a gift that comes from above, which is that God just expresses his love for us, and it activates a component of our soul that's higher than emotion and intellect, right? We function on a conscious level in the space of emotion and intellect. That's where we, in a sense, have control, or at least the ability to influence. But on a soul level, which is much higher than that, we can't really activate that on our own. So God activates that for us as a gift. Sometimes when we make the effort to build that relationship, God says, okay, I'm ready to give you a gift, but it's not a direct correlation. In other words, it's not, we don't create the result. We just trigger, so to speak, God's effort to activate that within ourselves. And that is this higher dimension that is the focus of this discourse. And in the prophecy of Bilam, the prophecy upon which this discourse is based, he has a comment: who can count Israel? I'm not including the whole verse there intentionally. Who can count Israel? And yet we find in the prophets it says, and the number of Israel will be like the sand of the sea. So which one is it? Is it that they can't be counted, or they can be counted? They're just like the sand of the sea. So the Talmud says that when we fulfill God's will, we can't be counted. And when we fulfill God's will, we're counted like the sand of the sea. So the Alter Rebbe is explaining that the notion of the sand of the sea is that near the ocean, it's very dry. Why? Because the ocean extracts the moisture that's in the earth in its vicinity. Whereas other places that are not at the edge of the sea, the earth is a little more clumpy, more cloddy. There's more moisture there. What is this analogy of moisture? So the Alter Rebbe told us about the Sea of Solomon, that when King Solomon built when King Solomon built the temple, he built this basin, this massive basin, that was seated on the backs of 12 oxen, right? With at each direction 3 oxen facing outwards. In other words, the backs were all facing inward underneath this basin. And this basin, while very fascinating from an architectural design and a historical notion, actually represents something very spiritually profound. What is this basin? So this basin is the transition point between the higher dimension and the lower three dimensions. What do we mean? So just as there's this notion within the human experience of thought, speech, and action, and we discussed this at length in the Kabbalah course, just as there are three dimensions of thought, speech, and action from where we operate, and then there's the essential experience of the soul, which transcends that. In a similar way, the four worlds parallel that. The lower three worlds are, in a sense, God as he's manifest in a tangible manner, right? As he becomes relatable. And then there's God as he transcends that, where he is, where he's beyond. In other words, we're experiencing the relationship with God as the relationship is, as God's manifestation is much more intimately connected with him. Without getting distracted, just a simple notion would be action, right? When I take action, it's outside of me. I'm expressing myself outward. When I speak, it's a little bit more ethereal. It's a little bit more connected with me, but it's still what's coming out of my mouth is a filter of what's in my brain. When I'm thinking, that's even more intimately connected with me, but it's still a faculty. It's still a tool. But then there's the intellect itself. The intellect itself is one with me. It's much more deeply connected on a more essential level. So the lower three worlds are thought, speech, and action. They're akin to thought, speech, and action. And then the highest world is God as he is in his most intimate manifestation within the realm of creation. Did that make sense? At least peripherally?
Qualified by saying within the world of creation, which implies maybe even higher level.
Yes. So God, pre-creation, we can't even use terms like intellect, right? Because God is beyond intellect. God is beyond kindness. God is beyond, these are all terms that we apply to create some kind of relationship. It goes so far that in Kabbalistic text, we talk about the experience, so to speak, in God himself as he begins the planning for creation, which takes place in this, beyond time. But it says that God evaluated within himself what it will be like in a created world, right? So that is like when we imagine what that is for ourselves, right? It happens even in a subconscious. Before we even have a desire for something, there's a part of us that imagines what will the experience be when I have fulfilled that want, when I have fulfilled that desire. So in a sense, there's already some kind of space inside of us that experiences something even before there's a conscious want. And then you have a conscious want, and then you begin to go through that process, and then you move into the space of intellect and emotion and application, thought, speech, and action until it actualizes. So we use that parallel to say that even pre-creation, there is some kind of notion of some space that God creates within himself for this future world. God's essence transcends even that. But we're not going that high. We're going into, when the Torah says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, it means that God created the spiritual realms and the physical realms. This is already the symptom, the initial contraction that God applied to bring the world into existence is already in play. And now we're talking about the first of the four worlds, known as the world of Atzilus, the world of emanation. And in that world of emanation, God's light shines. I'll give you another fascinating brain twister a little bit, and I don't want to get distracted with it. It's a very, very profound concept, but just to kind of draw the distinction. So here you have a cup and you have a liquid inside of it, right? Without the vessel, the liquid has nowhere to go. So you need to have a vessel before you have the liquid, before you put something into the vessel. And that's true whether you're talking about a cup of coffee, whether you're talking about your brain function, right? If you want to put intellect into someone's head, they have to have a head. There's actually a Yiddish saying that when I give you the cup, whether you're smart or not, the cup is in your hand. But if someone communicates information, not everybody's going to take it in. Why? Because not everybody's got the brain function to do that. So the expression in Yiddish is a cup kemenish daruf stellen. You can't put a head on someone. Either they have it or they don't. Right? You can't, no matter how much information you send at someone, if they don't have the tool, they don't have the receptacle, it's not going to do anything for them, right? So there needs to be a vessel. Now, when we talk about God creating, who creates the vessel? God does. And what does he make it out of? Divine light. So God makes a vessel of divine light, and then in the divine light, he puts divine light. Right? So how does that work? So part of the function of the concealment, part of the process of creation, what is known as yesh me'ayin, ex nihilo, something from nothing, is a function where the vessel no longer recognizes that it is a divine being. By the way, we are the greatest example of it, right? We're conscious beings, and we walk around sometimes disconnected from the reality that we are completely and totally sustained by the divine, right? So at every level, let alone inanimate objects and even in the spiritual realms, the vessel is in a sense something separate from the light that goes into it. But that's only in the lower three worlds. In the first of the four worlds, the world of emanation, the vessels and the light, it says in Kabbalah that the vessels and the light are one. God and his light are one, and he and his vessels in that world are one. So what does that mean? That means that if you are witnessing that world, you'd be overwhelmed by the intensity of it. There's no concealing force that actually allows for us to experience that light in a way that we can internalize. So therefore, there needs to be a filter. The light needs to come through a filter so that on the other side of that filter, there could be a self-consciousness that can now receive the light. That filter is this, as a metaphor, is this Sea of Solomon, this basin that Solomon built. Because it's actually called Yam Shel Shlomo, the sea of Solomon. What is a sea? So he tells us that a sea so the sea represents the notion of concealment, right? Everything is hidden in there, but there's stuff in there. There's a whole world in the sea. We'll come back to that in a few moments. And the sea is sitting on the backs of these 12 oxen. So what is that? Again, let's do the visual. You've got this world of Atzilus, this world of emanation, right? It's passing through the sea, which now is this transition point between a place of concealment. But what comes out on the other side, what's underneath this sea, in other words, what filters through, in a sense, are these 12 oxen. We already now see serious fragmentation. There's a self-consciousness. And these 12 oxen represent the fragmentation that exists in the conscious world. So the more, in a sense, the world descends, good morning, the more the world descends from level to level, the more fragmentation there is in our own consciousness. It's not real, meaning God is as present in the fragmentation as he is in the non-fragmentation. But our experience, because our frequency is on a different channel, we see the fragmentation instead of seeing the divine light that energizes it. And this comes into being through this sea. Why? Why is this sea the transition point? So we know that there are 10 fundamental building blocks of creation, right? The 3 intellectual, 7 emotional, the sephiros, the 10 dimensions of each world. Important stuff, but we're not going to get lost in it today. The lowest of the 10 is known as Malchus. Malchus, simply translated, is royalty or nobility. What is the power of a king? or a queen. What is the power of royalty? It's an aura. It's not, you can have a king who physically has no physical strength. They may even be very unpopular, but they carry a lot of influence. Why? Because their aura, the aura of them and around them, is one of royalty, of exaltedness, of being above everyone else. I think I shared this last week, but I definitely shared this before, that last summer, Dina and I ended up in Scotland, and just happened to be, we ended up on the day that the coronation of the king the king took place. We didn't know that was happening, and it wasn't as big as it was in England, but we happened to be there, and we were standing there. We didn't actually get to see the king, but the whole, all the fanfare, all the pomp and circumstances, and then this car came by, like one of these glass top cars, and in the car was the crown, and it really hit me, it really touched me. It was something about the crown. I wasn't even looking at the king, I was looking at a crown. I was like, wow. And this is not a king of old, right? I mean, there's royalty there, but it's not by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't have the power of the kings of old. But yet, even so, the crown had this wow, this is something profound. This is something exalted, something powerful, right? So that notion of the royalty is really this notion that the king, the royalty, actually is somewhat removed. That's really the power, that the king, the royalty, is removed. Now, what does that mean, the king is removed? The king is both present and removed. Present meaning the king has power and influence, even if you don't see the king, because that's the power of the king. So in that sense, he's present, but he's removed because he doesn't have to be there to have influence. When we walk into a room, we bring an energy with us. Even if no one's looking at our face or our body language, we bring an energy because each person has energy, right? And when we leave the room, we leave some of that energy there. So how much more so when we're talking about someone who, for whatever reason, possesses this quality of royalty, that they carry this influence. So when we're talking about that divine level of God, Malchus, the lowest level of this highest world, this level, the sea that we're talking about here, it has this kind of transitional quality. On the one hand, it has influence, but on the other hand, the influence remains exalted, which is exactly what we need in order to function, right? We need to know that God is there, but only insofar as it keeps us striving for connection, but not so much that it overwhelms our consciousness. Because if it overwhelms our consciousness, we no longer have free choice. And if it's completely removed, we become narcissistic. So we have to have that tension. It's a perfect balance between a conscious state, being aware of the presence of God and purpose and meaning in life, and being aware of self. And that's where life is lived, in that tension. So that is why Malchus, specifically this lowest level, is the key to creating this transition. So now, if this is the sea, let's bring this full circle here. If Malchus, the transition point, is the sea, so what's around the sea? What did we say before is around the sea? Sand. There is more fragmentation in the vicinity of the sea than there is elsewhere. In other words, the result of the ocean, the result of the sea, is that it causes fragmentation. And that's what we see here as well. This Sea of Solomon, this level of Malchus, this level of royalty, is the transition point that creates the fragmentation on the other side, right? Let's bring this home in a very real way for ourselves. We're going to be entering into, on Tuesday and Wednesday, we enter into the final month of the Jewish calendar year, the month of Elul. And it's a time of reflection. We start to blow the shofar, and we recognize that Rosh Hashanah is a mere month away, right? So we already are feeling the energy of the new year. We're feeling the holiness of the days. It's there's a beautiful description, if you want to look it up on Chabad.org, the previous Rebbe, who describes what it was like as a child to experience the month of Elul in the city of Lubavitch, in the little village of Lubavitch, where the Chabad movement originates. And he would say that already on the Shabbos, the Shabbat that precedes the month of Elul, there was already a certain energy that changed. People were a little bit more serious, and he said there was like a teshuvah, a wind, an aura of returning that you felt in the air. It's very descriptive, and it's very energizing. But the notion is that, when we're disconnected spiritually, there's more fragmentation in our lives, right? The same experiences that we have in life that throw us off don't throw us off as much when we're plugged in. What's the difference, right? If you're engaged in a regular spiritual practice, you meditate every morning, you pray every morning, you're engaged in study, in intellectual pursuit, you're engaged in acts of kindness. When something doesn't go 100% right, you don't fall apart so quickly. Why? Because you're in the zone of something higher. And the higher you go, the more things are unified, the less fragmentation there is. The further you go away, the more fragmentation there is. So that's what this transition point does, is it creates the fragmentation. It births the ability for there to be fragmentation. The tension now exists, right? Now we have to struggle to plug ourselves in, to anchor ourselves so there's not as much fragmentation. Because that's really what we want. We want things to be, equilibrium means there's less fragmentation. That's what we all strive for. We want things to just be okay. We don't want to struggle so much. We don't want to see, bad stuff in the world. We want things to make sense. We want things to flow. And that's wishful thinking. But at least within ourselves and within our own lives, we have the ability, if we plug into a spiritual program, to be able to anchor ourselves so that we're not as moved back and forth. We're not thrown around as much by the struggles of the world, because we recognize God's presence in those experiences. So let's see. I'm going to read this all in the text. I'm going to start on top of 36. Okay, it's just good to see it in the words. The Ein Melech B'Lo. There is no king without a nation. In other words, God needs to have a nation in order for him to be a king. Mark, do me a favor. Can you put that down to like 70? Thank you. God needs there to be we need to be something conscious, separated from God, in order for God to be a king, right? If we're not something separate, then you can't be a king over yourself. So God wants to be a king, so there needs to be something or someone's that, at least in their perception, think of themselves as something separate from God. Now God can be a king. So there has to be a consciousness in the fragmentation. And the ability for there to be a people, a separate conscious people, comes from the king's exaltedness himself. By the way, if you think about it, when you're in the presence of the king, right, there's less self-consciousness there. You're more subservient, right? In the temple, when the temple stood and they would pray and they would hear God's name proclaimed, everybody would fall flat on the ground. They would prostrate themselves, right? What's the notion of the notion of prostrating oneself is there's no me. There's only one consciousness here, right? But not in that presence, you walk upright. It's the same notion as when you're plugged in spiritually, there's no me, there's only the divine presence. So that comes from the fact, so that the ability for there to be a me, a self-consciousness, comes from God's exaltedness himself, because God, so to speak, keeps himself exalted. So therefore, there's space for us. Like by way of analogy, the king, when the king is on the throne, then because of the royal display of the king's glory, So everybody trembles before the king, and they become humbled before him. So the result of God's being exalted is that he creates a world that has fragmentation. But what's fascinating is that fragmentation is also infinite. In the fragmentation, it doesn't lose its infinite capacity. Even in the fragmentation, you have the infiniteness of the divine. So we have he quotes here it says that there is there a number of his legions of angels, and so the Talmud says that the a legion of angels has 10,000 of angels. So he says it's a contradiction. You're saying, is there a number? And you say, yes, there is. There's 10,000. He says, well, but there's infinite numbers of those 10,000, right? There's infinite number of brigades. And elsewhere it talks about the idea of reproduction, right? That one generation after another constantly reproduces. We see the power of the infinite there. And that's true in humans and in animal life and in vegetable life. It's constantly being reproduced. Or you see the notion that the sun and the galaxies, right? Everything is constantly moving. It's following the same pattern consistently. These are all manifestations of this concept of the infiniteness that we find within creation. So on the one hand, there's an exaltedness that allows for the self-consciousness and the fragmentation. But on the other hand, even in that fragmentation, you still maintain the king's royalty, you still maintain the infiniteness that exists there. But since they ultimately are born out of the exaltedness of the king, so therefore we see that as that light descends into the physical reality, it creates a fragmentation, not only in number, but also a fragmentation in type, right? In kind. We have all kinds of things that exist in this world, all kinds of trees, all kinds of animals, all kinds of insects, all kinds of people, all kinds of everything, right? It's so fragmented because when the divine light is gone, it creates so much space for so much diversity. But okay, so now he asks the question: how is it possible for them to receive all of this fragmentation, to receive from this divine manifestation of God's royalty, God's kingship, if God is exalted from them, right? So how is it possible? How could all of this fragmentation receive from this exalted state of God? So he says, the answer to this is that in truth it says that Hashem and Elokim, which we'll explain in a minute, is like the sun and its protective shield, which is God's infinite ability to actually bring this paradox into being. So the question that he's asking is like this: if God is exalted, then how is creation actually happening? A, and B, how is creation happening in such a fragmented manner, right? If God is in it, so then you can say God is constantly bringing about the creation in its fragmented manner, even though, as we said, that poses a different challenge, that how does the created matter maintain its self-consciousness? But at least from within this created structure, how is it that all of this diversity nurtures from a God that is in an exalted state? And the answer the Alter Rebbe says is that it really is a paradox. Particularly in the discourses of the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he would weave all kinds of complex questions to pose these really deep intellectual struggles of how things can function And his conclusion would be that God is what's called nimna hanimnois, which means he's the impossible of impossibilities. In other words, your question's a good question. And the answer is because he's God, he can create a paradox. We're trying to understand something from a rational, intellectual standpoint. That how could this paradox exist? The answer is that God is paradoxical. God is all able. And in it, it's just to kind of confuse things even more, I think it's Rabbi Chaim Vital says that one who says that God only has the ability to be infinite, but not the ability to be finite, is misguided in terms of God's true ability. You're limiting God in doing that. So you say, wait, so God could be finite? Well, what happened to his infiniteness if he's finite? The answer is yes. God is all powerful, and he could be both infinite and finite. Because otherwise you're limiting God. So God has the ability through this process of what he calls here the sun and its shield, or Hashem and Elokim. Hashem being the light of God, Elokim being the contracting force, right? This paradox works together to create the result of a paradoxical existence. That on the one hand, we have a self-consciousness, and on the other hand, we're totally enlivened only by the divine. And even though we're enlivened by the divine, we're not overwhelmed by it to the point that we lose our own self-consciousness. We say in the prayer, we say, Bayom Hahu Yihya, on that day, he will be Hashem Echad Ushmo Echad. He and his name will be one. What does that mean, he and his name will be one? It means that the name of God is a concealment. That's its function, is it hides on the true essence. On that day, he and his name will be one, meaning there won't be any division between the name and he. We'll be able to see through the concealment. I'll tell you another thing. This was actually, we spoke about this at length yesterday at services. The opening of the Torah portion we read yesterday says, God says, see, I place before you today life and death, the blessing and curse, life and death. So a lot of questions about this verse, but one of the commentators tell us that blessing and curse is not blessing and curse, but blessing and its exchange. So what does it mean, blessing and its exchange? So the Rebbe explains that everything in life can either be a blessing or it could be the opposite of a blessing. It's all the same. What does it mean it's the same? It's all divine manifestation. We gravitate to things that are easy, that look good, that make us feel good. So we see, oh, person had a baby, wonderful. They got married, wonderful. I won the lottery, wonderful. My business is doing well, wonderful. I have health, wonderful. And then suddenly when things go sour, we suddenly say not wonderful. Wait, is it coming from the same God or is it not coming from the same God? It is coming from the same God. But here God is presenting it in one fashion. Here God is presenting it in a different fashion. And if we are able to recognize that and we dig beneath the surface, and we're not saying that we prefer a life of challenge, but when we experience challenge and we're able to look beneath the surface, we see the blessing in it. So what makes something a blessing or a curse is how we internalize it, how we digest it. But it's all the same God manifesting itself. And in fact, the challenges that we have are actually a greater expression of God than the blessings that come to us in an open way. So when we face challenge and we say, hold on, God is present here. Let me dig and see where godliness is found there. And we truly invest ourselves, we suddenly uncover gems that we wouldn't have had it otherwise. People who navigate real challenges in life and come out the other side tell you that they've learned things about themselves. They've learned things about life. It pushed them places in life, monetarily, health-wise, financially, relationship-wise, right? Imagine a relationship that never experiences challenge. It's not a very deep relationship. A relationship that experiences challenge, you uncover your own inner dimensions. But it's the same God. It's the same God expressing himself here and expressing himself there. So whether it's a blessing or it's exchange, that's on us. That's on us to navigate. How is that possible? How is it possible that God could be both here and there? Because he is. Because he's all able. And that is the paradox. That paradox is born from this level of malchus. The paradox comes from this transition between the higher worlds and the lower worlds, because it possesses both qualities. On the one hand, it's a transition that conceals. It's the ocean. We can't see what's in the ocean. But on the other hand, it's exalted, meaning it's a manifestation of God's royalty, of God's divine nature. So that's the outcome. The outcome is that it exists in these two components. Okay, let's take a minute or two for questions before we go further. Any questions? Yeah.
What is the role of the which I was like? So the idea of for change to relationship, right? You can put change to your partner, or your partner can put change to you, and then you go to the destination. So the one direction of that challenge might be if it's already there is challenge to grow about yourself, or you can to does it play any role in the discourse, or is it just
So are you asking about the choices that we make, or from our perception of the experience? Okay, so I heard a rabbi once give a talk on marriage, and he says, sometimes people get frustrated in marriage and they say, I don't need this, right? I don't need this in my life, right? So he said, when somebody says, I don't need this in my life, they're disconnected from what we're talking about here. Meaning you don't need this. God wouldn't have brought it to you if you didn't need it. It's in your life because you need it. So stop fighting, I don't need it, and try to start figuring out what you need, right? And what you need is to stop looking that way and look this way. I heard from another rabbi, a great talk. He says that he's very creative. He takes all of our, like the things that are the jaggedy edges of my being, and the jaggedy edges of the things that irk me and the things that irk my wife, and he set us up perfectly so that she irks me and I irk her. Right? And there's the things that it's perfectly designed for us to be in a relationship with someone who's going to poke us in the very places where we're sensitive, and that we are perfectly designed to poke them in the places where they're sensitive. Why? Because that's how we grow. So if I don't need this, then you're never going to grow. But if you recognize that it's part of the divine structure, then you're gonna dig deeper. You're gonna try to figure it out. Now, we each have the capacity for free choice, how we're going to show up with another person in life in general. But again, without going off on this tangent, the choices that we make are only the choices that we make. But the outcomes, the results of the choices are divinely structured. So no one has the capacity, no one can hurt me unless God wants them to hurt me. They can want to hurt me. But if I get hurt as a result of their actions, it has nothing to do with them, it has to do with God. Which is why in the book of Tanya, the same author of this discourse writes that anger, it's brought down in the Talmud, that anger is akin to idol worship. Why? Because when I'm getting angry at someone or something, I'm basically saying that thing has power of its own to do something to anger me. I read this story yesterday. I shared this story. It's a great story. I have to give a little context. So every Saturday we read the Torah. And so basically 7 people are called up to the Torah. And then there's an 8th person who gets called up. It's like the dessert. And that person reads an extra section from the books of the prophets. So it's a big honor. It's like the biggest honor of the whole ceremony. But before that person reads that section, they raise the Torah, right? Somebody raises the Torah, and somebody else ties the Torah. Puts the strap around it and covers the Torah. Now, of all of these things, the one that's least popular in the ceremony is the one that ties the Torah. even though it's actually most important, right? Because you're putting the Torah away, but it's the least from a social value. It's the least important, right? Oh, you get called to the Torah. You get called to the Torah. You're very important. Oh, you get you get to read the extra section. What do you get? You get to tie the Torah. Okay, so there was this wealthy individual who came to his rabbi. He tells his rabbi, he says, I have a problem. I have a short temper. And I can't seem to get control of it. So the rabbi says to him, don't make such a big deal out of it. You're making just don't worry about it. Okay, the rabbi says not to make a big deal. I won't make a big deal. Then he calls the synagogue attendant, the gabbai, and he says, this Saturday, instead of this guy, this wealthy person, always got the 8th section, where he read the extra section from the prophets. He says, instead of giving him that section, give him the responsibility to tie the Torah. So the guy says to himself, he says, well, I can't do that. I mean, he's going to get so angry. He's such a short temper and he's going to be so insulted. So, but the rabbi says, you got to listen to the rabbi. So he came up with the solution. He's going to go and tell the wealthy person in advance that he should expect that this is what's going to happen. So at least he'll get the anger out of his system. So he tells the guy, okay, that Saturday in services, indeed, he calls him up to tie the Torah instead of calling, and everybody's like waiting for him to break out in anger, and he doesn't. He stays calm the whole time. So after Shabbat, the rabbi calls this individual, and he says to him, I see that you got called up for the to tie the Torah instead of the mafter reading, and you seem to be calm. He says, how was it that you didn't get angry? So he says, I see you didn't get angry. It seems like you cannot get angry. He says, it's different. Why is it different? He says, because the synagogue attendant came and told me that the rabbi had told him not to give me that section and to give me the responsibility to tie the Torah. So I knew that something was up. I knew you had a plan here. I trust you. I respect you. So why am I going to get angry when I know that the rabbi's got a plan here, right? So the rabbi said the same thing is true with everything you experience in life. There's always a plan. God always has a plan. It's not the rabbi, it's God. God always has a plan. So the fact that you don't know what the plan is, that's why you're getting angry. Lean into the fact that you know that God has a plan. Don't get so nervous. So no one can do something to us unless it's part of God's plan. Now, we're still culpable for our choices. But on the receiving end of it, when I experience something, so I don't have to get angry at you. I have to say, why is God sending this my way? What am I to do with this? What message am I to receive from this? What learning is available for me? Now, you have to deal with your choices. That's between you and God, right? But I have to, my job is to reflect on what I'm experiencing.
Whole different direction. I'm curious about as you're ascending to 10 levels of like higher consciousness. I love how you're talking about how you have to have separation to some extent to attain differentiation so that you don't become overwhelmed. But like for me, as I've been pursuing a more mystical path, like I feel like the goal is right to ascend to a higher level, which is complete immersion into Hashem and Hashem into me, right? It's like this whatever. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that. Is that a good goal? Is it one that you pursue but you never reach? Like where do you fall on that?
Well, let's imagine you got there. What would you do then?
Hopefully you're fine.
And what does that mean? What does that mean, nirvana? What does that mean?
I guess in really like, I haven't thought this, but in like most basic terms, it would feel like the parts of being human that are less than desirable become, like sort of a distant memory or whatever. Like you're some of the struggle, some of the pain, some of the hard parts of being human begin, at least in a spiritual sense, obviously not in this physical space here, but in a spiritual world, in your spiritual inner world, sort of fade away and you become more blended with God. Kind of like you were saying with if you have achieved a higher state of consciousness, things on the outside don't bother you as much. So that we just continue to get better and better.
Okay, so it's a great goal as long as we understand why we're going for that goal, right? the goal is not to stay in that space. And by the way, practically, we can't stay in that space, right? At some point, you got to come back down to earth and eat and function and go to work and stuff like that. But even as a goal, we're not here for personal perfection. The reason that we work on our character is not because we're trying to achieve some personal state of perfection. Like, I'd rather party. Like, what I'm saying, like, seriously, like, I need to, like, who am I that I need to arrive at some kind of state of perfection? And if you give me a choice, I'd rather party and have a good time than work on my character, right? I don't work on my character. Now, some people are really invested in that, but only because there's some notion that there's a value in that, right? We work on our character because that's why God put us on this earth. So trying to, even if in theory one could truly reach that state of consciousness, what would be next? What would be next is to take that state of consciousness and bring it back down into our reality, right? So the goal isn't to eat, peas and carrots, and to remove yourself from engagement in the world, because then the world loses out. The goal is to get plugged in spiritually and bring all that spirituality into the world. By the way, this is not the belief of every faith. It is fundamental to Judaism. One of the challenges that we have today is that Islam actually believes that the afterlife is better than this world. So you've heard people say this from Hamas at the beginning of this war, that the problem is that we believe in death and you believe in life, right? What does that mean? What does it mean to believe in death? It means that checking out of this world, in other words, giving up your life for whatever it is the ideal. In Jewish thought, the notion of giving up one's life is actually a paradoxical event, and only comes because God instructed us to do that when we have those rare occasions where it needs to be. But there's only 3 commandments that one is obligated to transgress. That there's only 3 commandments that one is obligated to not transgress and give up their lives for. The other 610 commandments, we have to transgress those commandments. No matter how wonderful God's commandments are, we violate those commandments and we don't give up our life, because this is where it's at. The greatest expression of godliness is in this physical reality. The greatest expression of godliness is in that inner struggle. So yes, you have those righteous individuals that achieve what you're calling nirvana, where they walk around with a divine consciousness. By the way, interesting enough, they are called the fish of the sea. The righteous are called the fish of the sea. Why? Because they're completely submerged in a divine consciousness, right? We're talking about Solomon's sea, which is this kind of spiritual state, right? They're completely submerged in there. So their functionality is not to be, their consciousness is perfect, but what their job is to bring that consciousness to the rest of us, right? We're not going to achieve that. I mean, maybe you, but not me, right? So where's the victory? The victory is in the struggle. And every time we engage in that struggle, the goal is to bring it back down into the physical consciousness. King Solomon says, Imratz libcha, if your heart runs, if it's running to God, shuv la'echad, return to the one. Return to what God wants from us, to the oneness of God. Where is the oneness of God found? Right here. If your heart is running to God, bring it back down here. You got to run. You got to activate the running, right? That's the goal. The goal is to bring enough of a divine consciousness into our awareness that we want to connect with God. And then we say, okay, God, I'm connecting with you. What do you want from me? I want you to go back down and eat your dinner and do it with intentionality. I want you to go out there and help somebody in need. I want you to go to work, and I want you to see the opportunity for the divine in your work. I want you to go exercise so you're healthy, so that you can live a life of meaning and purpose, right? That's where God put us. He didn't make us angels. He made us physical beings. This is the end of the food chain. This is the intention of all of everything that precedes us is right here. This is where it's at.
Can we become angels? Or is it something
we can't become angels, even though you're an angel. We can't become angels because angels are without a physical body. They have a spiritual body, but they don't have a physical body. In the afterlife, the soul separates from the body, and we are just souls. The ultimate reward is in the Messianic era when the souls are returned to the bodies. So that's a very important point, and it emphasizes this messaging, right? The ultimate is where you have a soul in a body that experiences the divine in a pure way in this physical state. There's no more struggle there, right? In other words, if we were able to wake up in the morning and be conscious of God, there's actually a very interesting passage. It says that when the Mashiach comes, we're going to yearn for the exile days. Why? Because this is where the magic takes place. This is where you can make change. I was at the cemetery on Thursday, the cemetery up in New York, and the tradition is you tuck your tzitzis, your fringes, you tuck them into your pants. And our custom is to wear them exposed, but when you go into a cemetery, you tuck them in. Why? Because you in a sense, you're making fun. You're poking fun at those that are buried there and saying, you can't do God's commandments. I can because I'm a living being. You can't. And that's the reality. When we place a body in the casket, there's a tradition you wrap the body in a talit, but we actually tear off a corner so the talit is not kosher, because you can't do a mitzvah when you're dead. And the Mishnah states that greater is one moment of good deeds and returning to God in this world than all of the world to come. So this is where it's at. For all of the struggle, for all of the frustration, right? People are in terrible pain. They have illnesses. They have emotional pain. But by and large, people don't check out. People understand. People know. I mean, sometimes people are in such terrible pain emotionally, psychologically, that they do take their lives. And that's really, our perspective about that is, for the most part, it's the illness itself is so intense that the illness kills them. It just kills them in an unconventional way. But inherently, people know this is where life is lived. This is where God is found. This is you can't connect with God. It might be a nice light show, but the real connection with God takes place here in this physical reality. Every time we do a good deed, we do a mitzvah, we study some Torah, we give tzedakah, you say a blessing on a cup of coffee, that's where the real connection takes place. And we inherently know that. That's why we don't run away from here. That's why people don't want to leave. It's against our will are we born, the Midrash says, and against our will do we die. The soul likes it up there. So it gets schlepped down here. But once it's here, it doesn't want to leave. It knows that this is where the greatness takes place, where the magic takes place.
Don't want to go far afield, but and I don't know a lot about this term, Hinduism, bodhisattva. That's the soul that goes to nirvana and comes back to do the work that you're describing. That's the Hindu or Buddhist. I'm not sure.
So that soul leaves the body in that faith and comes back, or while in the body?
They transcend the body through spiritual exercises, but it's taught that that's not the goal. The goal is to come back.
Very interesting.
Altruistic function. When they come back, they can shed their life on others.
We have the story in the Torah of the sons of Aaron, whose names were Nadav and Avihu. And it was at the dedication of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, in the desert. And it says that they brought a strange fire and they died. And then Moses comes to Aaron and he says that I knew that God's name would be sanctified, but I thought it would be sanctified by those that are close to him. And I thought it would be you and me, because we're the closest to God, Aaron and Moses. But I see that your sons are holier than you and I. So what's this story? So the Kabbalah tells us that Nadav and Avihu awakened within themselves this unbelievable yearning for God, this desire for nirvana, right? They wanted to connect. The thing is that they actually succeeded. Their body no longer was able to contain their soul. And because their body wasn't able to contain their soul left their body. It left. You got so excited. The soul left the body. The body wasn't able to contain it any longer. And so there's and the next immediately, the Torah, one of the commentators, amongst the things that they did, the strange fire wasn't, it was a godly fire. It was this burning desire inside of them. It also says that they were intoxicated when they came into the Mishkan, which, again, what we understand from what does it mean they were intoxicated? It means they weren't blackout drunk. It means that they took something that helped still the body to allow the soul to be fully experienced. And immediately after the story, the next section is God's instruction through Moses that the priests are not allowed to drink wine. When they serve, they're not allowed to drink wine. They're not allowed to be intoxicated, even a little bit of wine. Why? Because that's not the end game. While it was a wonderful journey and wonderful to look at as a one-time event, and it's important, we have this story to tell us both the opportunity and the dangers. That's not the end game. What they did ultimately for us is sinful. If one arouses their desire for divine connection to the point that your body can't hold you down, that's sinful. Because God doesn't want us up there. He put us down here, right? And we understand that whether you're taking a drug to make that happen, right? The oftentimes the people that are taking the drugs are escaping, right? What they're escaping physical pain. So maybe their pain comes from some kind of trauma that they experienced, or just the very trauma of existence. We're also escaping the pain. You don't need to have an addiction to be escaping pain. The pain is the confines of the body. The body says, me, me, me. And my soul says, no, not you, God. And the body says, thank you very much, maybe today, but I want my steak. I want my coffee. I want my pleasures. I want. And the soul says, it's not about you, it's about God. And we push up against that. So we're also in pain. So the Torah says that to run away to heaven is not the way to do it. That's not the end game. Let's change our attitude. The attitude is, yes, dear body, I understand you want, and I'm here to help you. But we're going to do this for the right reason. We're going to enjoy that steak. We're going to enjoy that steak so that we can serve God. We're going to go to work to make, there's nothing wrong with enjoying the material world. So important. It's fundamental to Judaism. The deepest of pleasures. Judaism supports it. In fact, the greater the pleasure, the more it's a metaphor for the relationship that we have with God. Intimacy is the greatest expression that two human beings can have. It's replete in Song of Songs. King Solomon talks about this beautiful love relationship that we have with God. It's a beautiful thing. There's nothing unholy about it, but we have to do it for the right reasons. And if we're engaged in any kind of material engagement for the right reasons, it becomes the holiest. So the end game is not to escape, run away from the material, run away from the physical pleasure. The goal is to bring it in, bring it down, bring it into the experience, bring it into the body, bring it into the world. So the souls of the righteous come down here to help us in that journey. And sometimes in the process of reincarnation, which Judaism believes in, that the soul goes to the afterlife, and then sometimes the soul comes back, sometimes multiple times. Sometimes the souls of the righteous come back down because that's their job. They're unique souls that come back down to help others. And they'll keep coming down until they're taken care of. Yeah.
Question about that.
Yeah.
We do reincarnate into different bodies, then when the Messiah comes and you say, we come back into our bodies, which body?
It's a great question. I'll add a few more questions. What happens if somebody dies and the spouse remarries? So who gets the soul? Who gets the spouse? there are a lot of questions about reincarnation, and what we have to understand is that we think about our initial relationship, a notion of a soul is this one dimension, right? It's one soul, but a soul is actually says that there are 600,000 primary souls, and there are many numbers of offshoots of those 600,000 primary souls. You take a diamond, right, and you shine a light through it. The light, there's many colors that come off of it. So all souls that come from the same primary soul have an interconnected relationship. It also says souls travel in packs and so on and so forth. But the soul that's inside of me is a dimension of one of those primary souls. We can actually share the same primary soul, but you don't have my consciousness. Definitely, you don't have my consciousness for sure. You don't even have my subconsciousness, because I have only one facet of that primary soul, and you have a different one. So the function of reincarnation is that every facet of every primary soul goes through a process of coming down to this earth, fulfilling its purpose, and when it completes its job on this earth, then it remains in heaven until the time of the coming of Mashiach. So again, we're talking about things that we're using human analogies for, but fundamentally that's the idea, is that it's multiple manifestations of the same primary soul, but they're different they're each individual and unique.
Still don't understand about which body, like, is it then it's just one primary soul comes into one body?
No, all the different facets of that same primary soul will end up in their respective bodies. So the facet of that soul that's in my body will come back to my body. That facet of that soul doesn't go to anybody else's body. A different facet does. And a different facet goes to another body, and so on. So when we say that the soul is reincarnated, we're talking about the primary soul's various facets.
The idea of 600,000 souls or facets.
Primary souls. One primary soul that gets manifest it says in 613 dimensions. In other words, each primary soul has 613 expressions, and some say that each of those 613 have 613. It's a lot of stuff.
Yes.
And the thing is like this, I think, again, it's not important. We have a tendency, especially in mystical practices, to try to identify, I'm sure you've read or heard of the book, Many Life, Many Masters, right? There's a tendency to want to plug into, where's my soul coming from? Who was I in a prior life? We don't really have the capacity to do that. And frankly, it's not important. There's enough for us to look at our own lives and to see where our strengths and challenges are, to recognize where our life's purpose is. We have our purpose right here. And the components that are empowering and challenging is God's way of saying, hey, this is where your work takes place. All right, a few quick announcements. So September 19th, we're beginning a new monthly lunch and learn. It'll be here. Take a flyer, sign up, let us know you're coming. Delicious lunch. September 20th, which is Friday evening, we're having it's been a challenging year for the Jewish people. And as we near a new year, on September 20th, we're going to be doing a unity Shabbat dinner. It'll be outdoors right here on the Beltline. 18 is a number of life. Our goal is to have 180 people. It's called Shabbat 180, a unity Shabbat. So we invite everybody to sign up, please, on our website at chabadintown.org. And looking forward to seeing you all next Sunday. Have a good barbecue.